What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another edition of the Clap Your Hands podcast, a draft preview edition. As always, brought to you by Odyssey Sports. Make sure you download that Odyssey app. You get all the episodes first. Brought to you by Sports Radio 94 WIP and brought to you by Kyle, a draft that I have fully convinced myself, despite the lack of picks, to be excited for. I feel like there's going to be moves. There's going to be rumors. Maybe they get in the top 10. Maybe they do absolutely nothing. Either way, I love rumors. I love trades and those things. So I'm all in for the draft. I'm ready to go for Thursday night. You feeling that same level of excitement?
I don't think so because as you noted, no draft picks for the Sixers based on a series of trades that have been made during Daryl Morey's tenure. So we don't know. Essentially, we're just operating in the unknown right now, which is fun to an extent. It's like, oh, what could they do? Are they going to buy their way into the second round? But you're not doing a podcast on buying a second round pick.
Just watch us. Just watch us after they do it. Oh, sorry. I thought you had more. Look at you already getting water. Already a few, only minute in. Already need that water. But all right. So I think there's a bunch of things I wanted to get into today. You mentioned buying the second round pick. You've reported that they're looking to do that. It is probably something that would be smart to do if they can. I think with Nick Nurse and his new roster, they're going to be looking for a different type of player. You get a low-cost, low-salary guy in the second round that you then have on a cost-controlled deal if you can do it. But as you mentioned, that is not the thing that is going to get people the most excited about Thursday night, especially waiting into that second round. I think in the first 15 picks, or at least the first round, that's where you're going to see a lot of the exciting rumors. That's where you're going to see a potential Tobias trade. So outside of the second round pick thing, which maybe we can get into in a little bit, my question for you, Kyle, coming to this is, what are the chances that the Sixers make a big move on draft night? You wrote an article this week on Philly Voice kind of outlining what could happen. Daryl Morey has been active on draft night in his career. What do you think the chances are this Sixers team is going to get some type of major reshaping on draft night?
I wouldn't say reshaping might be strong because that makes it sound like, to me, that's you're moving core pieces. I guess if you consider Tobias Harris a core piece, then maybe we could say that. I think the likeliest major move they could make is trading Tobias Harris. And for anybody who didn't read the piece this week, essentially this draft is going to create a lot of motivation for teams who want to make big moves to do them now before the new league year, because the teams that are over the cap, even the first apron, I know we've talked about the second apron on here, teams that are over that in the luxury tax at all have much less wiggle room when it comes to putting together trades for salary matching purposes. So if you're moving a guy like Tobias Harris, who's going to make $39 million next year, and you're trying to, on both ends of that deal, it's, whoever's sending role players back or swapping another big contract, maybe longer term contract for Tobias, are going to be subjected to these new rules that make it a lot harder to match up salaries. And so I think there's a lot of smoke out there suggesting Tobias will be moved, or at least there's an expectation around the league that he's going to get moved at some point. So to me, if that's the case, then I would say there's a decent chance that it happens on Thursday night, because if they wait until later in the offseason and James Harden is back on his deal and so on and so forth, well, then you have limited options in terms of what you can do, who you can trade with, what kind of players you can get back. And so there's a bit of urgency for them to get going and get moving if that's a move they're exploring.
So I've been thinking a lot about what you said last pod, that Tobias is probably their biggest trade piece they have left. When you look at the future picks. And to that point too, if this new CBA is going to impact their ability to move him once it starts, you can make an argument Tobias's trade value is never going to be higher than it is on Thursday night because of the cap ramifications, his contract, those type of things. And once you bring him in for the season, I know Daryl has shown a willingness to do that. Obviously, he did that with Ben, but I don't think Tobias is somebody they really want to bring into training camp and then make that major move with him at some point that year. So to that regard, do they have to trade Tobias on Thursday night? Is this their real big chance to do it? And if they don't, are they blowing an opportunity?
I don't want to say they have to, but I think what's interesting to me is that all the moves that they probably can make are the ones I don't think they necessarily want to make. So,
Hmm.
for example, we talked a lot about Bradley Beal, and obviously he went to Phoenix, and that was kind of a foregone conclusion, it seems, that he was just forcing his way there, and that's where he wanted to be. And they gave up basically nothing to get him.
Yeah.
And it's if you're going to chase a star rather than, hey, we'll bring back 2, 3 role players, whatever it is, that scenario requires you to take some kind of risk. Like it is going to be, hey, we're going to try to put together a package for Zion, who, for on and off court reasons, is
Yeah.
having quite an interesting offseason in New Orleans. It might be buying low on Zach Levine, who I don't think they're in on based on what I've heard, but I know the Bulls are actively shopping basically their entire roster. I don't think they're not locked into anything basically. So I think you're going to hear up until unless Levine gets traded, there's just going to be a lot of scuttlebutt this summer about what they
Mhm.
might do. And so these are the type of guys you might be able to get. You're not going to get Dame Lillard for this type of package. Like, I don't think it doesn't look like Portland is trading him. In fact, it might be the opposite right now that they're going to trade. They're in a position to trade for somebody like Zion using the number 3 pick and using whatever contracts you have to do to make that work to try to please Dame over the next few days. So I think the Sixers are in this weird middle ground where they don't seem to be super enthused about the players who are theoretically available for
Yeah.
a Tobias contract swap. And so I think they probably should make a deal, but I don't know that they are going to make a deal.
So with Tobias, and actually what you just said caught my attention real quick. Do you think there's a chance they don't trade him? Like, you think there's a chance Tobias is on this roster opening night?
I think there's a chance, yeah, because I think, as much as it's an opportunity where we can say, well, he's got a big expiring contract, and that's pretty important in the new CBA.
Hmm.
You could make that's the pitch you make to other teams, but you also have to think about it yourselves as the
Yeah.
Sixers. You say, look, this guy's going to come off the books. We're not locked into long term money, and we can sort of see how this plays out over the long term with how punishing is that second apron going to be. Like, so for example, we already know Phoenix will be a second apron team. So that takes one contending team out of contention for guys on the taxpayer mid-level exception. And
Hmm.
so let's say, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 teams end up at that second apron level. Well, if that's the case, then maybe the Sixers have a better ability to recruit those type of players. You might be able to get one of the best taxpayer MLE guys on the market. And so that's
Hmm.
an advantage you can create in
It's a
that
good
way.
point.
And so maybe Daryl Morey sits back and says, well, that's the best path rather than, I don't know, you're going to break down Tobias Harris's contract into like Tim Hardaway Jr. and another role player, or
Right.
just make up role players that are on maybe like another 2 to 3 years worth of contract. So I'm not sure what they're going to do, and I'm not sure that they feel the urgency to get something done because they have to get something done. But it's a fascinating question. It's because it's a completely new. The last CBA, they didn't really change a whole lot in terms of how the league's going to operate. These are pretty dramatic changes that everyone in the league is talking about openly and actively. And so I wonder if they're going to choose caution, or Daryl Morey's history suggests he's willing to be a bit aggressive and say, screw it, we'll figure it out later.
Well, so what's interesting is oftentimes, you always hear like you can't make decisions based off of fans. And I definitely think that's 9 out of 10 times you're right. You don't let public perception impact the moves you make from a roster perspective. If you look at the Eagles, they would have fired Howie Roseman, right? Like there are times where you have to push through fans being really frustrated about things. But I do wonder if they bring back Toby in next year, because that's a good point. If they stay under that second apron, and let's say they're one of 7 teams that has a legit chance to win a title, but only 2 of them are able to hand out the mid-level exception, and they're one of them, you are going to be able to add better players to fill your roster out than those other teams. But if they bring back Toby, and let's go ahead and assume they re-sign Harden, because it still seems to be trending in that way, I don't know, man. Like, are fans going to accept that? I've heard all week, or really since the end of the season on WIP, they're like, how would they justify bringing the team back? And to me, I think they can justify it easily. They almost beat the Celtics in the second round. They were one of the best teams in the league last year, all those things. I don't know. How do you think running it back with this team would go over with the fans? And do you think that's something this team would consider when debating whether or not they can trade Toby or bring back Harden?
Well, it wouldn't go over well. I think
No,
you and I both
that's
know
what I
that.
mean. Yeah.
Like, that's pretty obvious that if they just bring back kind of the same team, especially with, I mean, we'll see what happens with the Phillies, but this is an Eagles team that everybody's really excited for. So when they
Yep.
get going in training camp and the regular season, and the Sixers are just trying to sell, hey, the gang's still here with, regular season basketball.
Yeah, run it
They're going to
back.
be fighting for any kind of attention for a long time, basically until the Eagles season ends. They'll be, and they're second fiddle even in a good year, but
Yeah.
it's going to be a more dramatic gap between a normal season and what we're going to see this fall, I think. But here's the thing, and I think Doc Rivers actually suggested this on his podcast with Bill Simmons, or his podcast interview with Bill
Yeah.
Simmons, that the Sixers and the Sixers brass will say we're a little too concerned with
Oh
the
yeah.
media and outside perception when he arrived there. And what I would say is they can't worry about, like, you always worry from a PR and all that kind of perspective. What does the fan base think of what we're doing? I think where you really want to pay attention to that is more with, like, what kind of jerseys are we putting out this year? It's not how should we build our team, because the way
Mhm.
you need to build a team is you sit in a room and you have meetings and you say, this is what we think is our best path to try to win a championship this year. And they can't worry about anything other than that. I don't know that that means keeping Tobias Harris. Obviously, we've seen him in the second round of the playoffs come up small pretty consistently, and he's on a big time contract. But all that being said, they need to do what's best for the team, even if that is running it back. It would probably drive me and you and a whole lot of other people crazy to watch the same or a similar
Yeah.
version of the same
Well,
thing next
yeah,
year.
basically
But,
the exact same.
what are their other options?
And I do wonder if internally they view Nick Nurse as a major addition, because I think we'll look and we'll look at the roster and fans will look at the roster and go, yeah, it's the same exact team. Why would I view it any differently? I do think internally they view Nick Nurse as a major kind of addition, but I also think we're probably underestimating. And you asked Nick Nurse this at his press conference. I think they believe Maxey is going to be way better next year, or at least take a step forward. And if that's the case, then that's basically like adding an elite perimeter player. Obviously, you would prefer to add another one on top of Maxey, but I think the Sixers believe with what they've done already and with Maxey, they're going to be better next year. I just don't know if the fans are, well, I know the fans are not going to buy into it until they get out of the second round. But with Tobias, another important question, I think, with him, outside of just do they need to trade him and should they trade him, is what are you trading him for? You mentioned how you could potentially trade Tobias for two players that are on 2-year deals, 3-year deals that are going to just improve the depth of your roster, maybe are more along the lines of what Nick Nurse is looking for. Or there's the kind of fun, trade him for a big star if you can. He is an expiring deal. He does have value. Zach LaVine, has been rumored just because they're willing to trade him. Like, where would you go with Tobias? Are you more in the mode of go flesh out the roster, add players to it? Or, yeah, this is a major trade piece. You have to go add a major singular piece to it.
If you can get a major piece that has real upside, I always think that that's the route you take, because look, as much as I think depth is important and role players are important, we sit here and say over and over again, star players are what get
Yeah.
it done in the
Yep.
playoffs, and star players are who are going to carry you to titles. And look, I don't think they have the type of package to go out and get Zion Williamson. As I said, I think if he gets moved, that's for example, the number 2 pick from Charlotte and salary matching, the number 3 pick from Portland and salary matching. The Pelicans have better options than, hey, we'll send you Tobias Harris and Jaden Springer and
Mm.
some second round picks and a 2029 first. But let's say you're able to get to the table with that. I would take the risk on Zion. Like, I know you were on the opposite side of this, but like, and look, there is real downside risk there. I totally understand that. Hasn't been able to stay healthy. We'll just say decision making has not been a strong suit from an off court perspective, it appears, in terms of who he surrounds himself with. It's unclear if work ethic is a problem or that's
I think
kind
it's
of been
clear
a murky.
it is a problem.
Yeah, that's been but I don't like to say that having not been around a guy and like it's easy to take pot shots from far away, whatever. I could say it's at least a question mark. We have to see if that's a real problem. Maybe you put him in the right situation with the right coach and that kind of stuff changes. But he is a significant enough talent. Like, I'm not saying that he would be on equal footing with Victor Wembanyama in terms of prospect hype or whatever. But there was a point in time where Zion was like, oh my God, this guy is going to be like the next whoever. Right. And he's the best prospect since Anthony Davis when he was coming out of Kentucky, or you could probably go even a little further back than that. His Duke season was must-watch TV. They go on a huge run in the tournament, despite being built around a bunch of freshmen who the other guys on that team, it turns out, have not been very good in the pros. So clearly he's doing a ton of the heavy lifting on that team. So you put him on the Sixers and you can do a ton of interesting stuff, like especially in a world where you keep James Harden too. Think about a bench lineup where you play small and Zion is essentially a center, and you just spread it out, and James Harden and Zion run pick and rolls. And you have a front court where it's Joel Embiid and Zion's a weak side rim protector, and he's got the help of Joel behind him, but he's also got Joel's ability to space the floor and give him space to drive into, to attack the rim and play make and do that kind of stuff. Maxey and Zion on a fast break, that's crazy. Like, that'd be must-watch television if you see those guys there. And that would certainly be a big change that's going to get people excited for the 45 games that Zion's going to play.
Right.
Like, but that's what I'm saying though, is like, I think it's worth taking that type of risk if you're where they're at this point, because the incremental stuff, like if you just keep bleeding away second round picks and individual first round picks, you trade one to get rid of Al Horford, you trade a couple for James Harden. At least in Harden's case, that makes a material difference. You take a step forward as a team. But if you're trading 4 second-round picks for, George Hill, like they did a few years ago, I just think if you keep making those moves, you're going to end up in a spot where you have no moves left to make anyway. So you might as well go for the big one and say, well, fuck it. We're going to go for broke, and we're going to try to put somebody on this roster that fundamentally changes our long-term ceiling. Like, that's where my mind would be at.
Yeah. So I think the best point for Zion is this is your last trade piece with Toby. Zion has top 10 player potential. So just go do it and figure it out. I get that argument. I definitely agree with it to an extent. My only issue with Zion is Toby is your last big trade piece, and living in a world where you can do that, Zion by December could either be the biggest steal an NBA team has made in a long time, or he could be the worst contract in the NBA. If you consider the fact of his 5-year deal, what he's being paid. And like, let's be honest, I know that he's had trouble staying healthy. And I agree with you, joking aside, we can't sit here and say if Zion's a hard worker and if guys get hurt, that's not their fault. But he doesn't strike me, even coming into the league, there were concerns about his body type and inability to stay healthy. If you look at Joel, let's take Joel, for example. Joel missed the first 2 years of his career. And since then, obviously, we can go through the whole injury concern, but he's mostly stayed healthy. He 60 plus, 55 plus games, nagging injuries for sure, playoff injuries, but he has been on the court. If you look at from when Joel stepped on the court for the first time, so year 3, he's played in something like, 67% of his games. So he's mostly been there. Since Zion started playing his rookie year, he's been in 30.
Not good.
Not good.
It's not good.
He did like 30 something games, right? He's missed a full year. He played.
Do you want me to go through I'll go through the
years.
2019-20 plays 24 games.
Yeah.
2020-21, where he made an all-star team, played 61, so that was an improvement. But then he missed the entire 21-22 season, and he played 29 games last year. So the last 2 years, he's played 29 total
Yeah.
games. It's
Yeah.
not
And
good.
it's not good. And also, we joked about the Bradley Beal thing, which is, and a lot of people did. Bradley Beal's been a career loser in a lot of ways. Can you add another loser to Joel and Harden? Like, do you need to add somebody else? Is Zion maybe like the worst possible person to add to Joel and James in terms of injury concern, but also, let's be real, like fitness, right? Like, it looks like one of his concerns is like, aren't there all types of weight clauses in his contract and stuff? And James, the joke is always, he looks fat, whatever. And Joel, we know because of his body type, has trouble keeping weight off if he misses time. I get the reasoning for considering it, but it just feels like it could be a deal that come December, we're like, well, that's it. Like, he's hurt again. They have this massive contract. Joel's upset because now their second big piece is turned into Zion. Zion doesn't seem to have a great relationship with his teammates in New Orleans. So I think the name itself is exciting. Not to mention, Zion does not shoot from deep. Like, he doesn't. Maybe he'll add it to his repertoire. Maybe Nick Nurse gets him to do it, but he averages less than 1 3-pointer a game. And I can get over that if he's doing different things. I mean, the dude averaged 27, like 6 and 5. He clearly can score. But I don't know. Is the best thing to add to your team somebody that doesn't shoot the most important shot in basketball, at least currently? So I would roll the dice if it's like there's no other options, like whatever. But I'd rather have Zach LaVine. I would definitely rather have DeMar DeRozan. Like, I think there are better options than potentially like crippling your franchise for a really long time with this Zion thing.
I understand the position. All I'm saying is that if we agree, so let's be clear. Tyrese Maxey is in theory their biggest trade chip, but
Yeah.
nobody wants to trade him. So when
Right.
we say Tobias Harris is their biggest trade chip left, you might as well shoot for upside, because once that leaves, you have to then trade like real foundational core
Like Embiid
pieces.
and Maxey. Like,
That's what I mean.
yeah.
So if trading Tobias and saying, all right, we'll take 2 role players back, that's essentially just betting that Joel Embiid and James Harden are good enough, or that Tyrese Maxey's internal development is good enough.
Mhm.
And where we're at right now, like, Joel's in his prime, in his late 20s. I don't know how much better he's getting, or how much more refinement he's going to have in big moments. James Harden, I think the ship has certainly sailed on him. He's not going to get better at this age. If
Right.
anything, he's going to get worse, and that's not an insult to him. That's just the reality of being in your mid 30s as a professional athlete. Maxey would then be your only real case to, okay, that guy's going to become a 25 point a game guy, or he's going to average 5-6 assists a game instead of 2 or 3.
Right.
And maybe that's enough to make a difference. But if you don't think that adding a couple role players is enough to push them over the top, then I can 100% see the argument to say, let's take a big swing. This might get broken up in a year or two anyway, because I don't know, Joel's unhappy. Harden decides he doesn't want to be here anymore. Because that's the thing. It's like, all this buzz about Harden in recent days, it's not, it seems to me that everyone's realizing, yeah, he's not getting the max contract elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So James has to look at himself and say, am I really going to take less than max money to go play in Houston? And it might be like a semi rebuild. I don't know what that roster is going to look like if he decides to go there. Or am I going to play for a contender? And then maybe he comes back here and he feels resentment. And he's like, well, I didn't actually want to be here.
Yeah.
But this was like comparable money and I can win a little more. He could wake up in 6 months to a year and say, well, get me the fuck out of here. And if that's the case, malcontent James Harden in his mid 30s is not getting a big trade return. So you already need to have some sort of big piece and big chip on the roster that could theoretically be a co-star to Joel Embiid. I don't think that Maxey is at that level. And so I think you might have to say, we're going to take a high risk, high reward bet on, I don't think they can get Zion, but it might be in that mold, I would say.
Well, and again, I'm always down for high risk in a lot of ways. One thing, if we agree Howie Roseman is the best general manager in the city, and Daryl has an argument over his career, but Howie's whole thing is take big swings. And so I could picture a world where now the contract complicates it. Like Zion is somebody Howie would take a swing on, right? Former number one pick. You mentioned all those things. The issue is you take that swing man, and all of a sudden, of all the good teams, like the top 8 teams or whatever, you could argue Embiid, Harden, and Zion might end up being 3 of the least attractive trade pieces. Like Bill Simmons did his trade value thing. He had Embiid 13th. Like he had Jaren Jackson right behind him. And I know it's just one person's opinion, blah, blah, blah. But it is interesting to think that for as much as Embiid can make the argument for best player in the league or top 3 or whatever, just won MVP, his trade value a year and a half from now might not be that good. He could be broken down on a massive contract. So that's the concern with Zion. Quick side note, I was thinking about this morning. Who do you think's more likely to be on the team longer from here on out? Joel Embiid or Tyrese Maxey?
I would say Joel, because I think if they were to strip it down and rebuild, like Joel gets traded, I think Tyrese gets moved too. Like I think it might just be everything happens at once. Well, because like think about this. You're probably okay with paying Tyrese Maxey whatever he's going to get on this next contract if you have Joel Embiid and if you have a co-star for him. Like Maxey as a well-paid third guy, that's okay. If you strip it down and Tyrese Maxey's making like $30 million as the guy, I think that is not where an NBA team wants to be generally. That's like, I like Tyrese as a decision maker more than Jordan Poole, but it'd be like if the Warriors moved into their next phase and we're like, yeah, Jordan Poole, you're just running the show. Like I just don't think that's a thing that you want to happen as a team. So I kind of think you just move everybody if you reach that point. Now maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Joel lasts out in 2 years and Tyrese has ascended, and you say, well, we'll turn Joel into multiple guys to help Maxey be the man. But I don't personally view him as that type of player. I think he's a very good complementary piece, but I kind of think that he would get moved before or with Joel if that kind of thing happened.
I could be dead wrong about this, but I really get a sense that they are like extremely high on Maxey. And so I could
They
picture
definitely are for sure.
Where I could picture a world where it gets frustrating and Embiid, you just like cash out early on him in terms of getting a big return, and you envision your team more built around guards and you think Maxey can be one of them. So I think it's close onto who. Now the difference is Maxey could potentially be traded against his will, whereas I don't think there's a world where they move Embiid and he does not want to be moved. So that would probably be the main difference. But so last Tobias Harris question before we kind of move on here. I do think in a way Tobias is now somewhat underrated by the fans because he does like not fit, but he's a good locker room guy. He's been here. They've won with him. You know, it works with him to a certain extent. He is an expiring contract. So I'm not just giving Tobias away for anything, but final kind of like, 1 through 10, if you want to do it that way. Friday morning, we wake up, the draft is over. What do you think the chances are that Tobias has been traded?
I give it at least a 1 in 3 shot. I don't want to go higher than that because there's not like an active team or a set of players that he's attached to in terms of rumors. There's just a broad feeling around the NBA. He's going to get moved. Like that's one of their big cards that they can play. And so everyone is just kind of speculating that he's going to get moved, but he very well couldn't. Like we could wake up in late September for training camp and Tobias walks in and does the same media availability that he does every year. So yeah. Who the heck knows?
Are there any, I know this is kind of like finding a needle in a haystack, but are there any players that you think Sixers fans should keep an eye on in terms of a trade for Tobias? Like not the Zion, Dame Lillard, those type of guys, but.
No, honestly, if I had that, I would have already reported it, I would say. And I'm going to be on some more phone calls today, tomorrow, Thursday, of course. And so we'll see what shakes out after all of that. But Nothing to report as of right now. I wish I had more information to provide, but
Well, if you're listening to this pod, I'm sure you already do, but that sounds like major. Make sure you're following Kyle on Twitter. Make sure you're reading his work on Philly
of
Voice.
course, always.
Always, exactly. I tweet about jerseys, you tweet about Sixers news, so it evens out in the long run. But now I think is probably the chance to get into our obligatory James Harden part of the pod. Lot more. I mean, you've been saying this, but a lot more kind of, he's not going to get that money. The Sixers have interest at a certain price. More and more reporters are starting to kind of do the whole Bill Simmons with the ultimate kind of 180 from going, basically Harden's not going to be back to, yeah, I'm hearing more and more he is going to be back.
Keith Pompey too, man. He was
I
at the
know, yeah,
combine saying he's
yeah.
definitely leaving, and then yesterday it's like, get your story straight, everybody. It's nobody can stick to one position. It's either report something and stand behind it, or you could just wait and see what happens. Which
Yeah.
I feel
So
like is a better.
I do wonder like how the Harden thing has kind of changed, but I think overall you're right. Like it looks like he's going to be back. So I guess the question, as I've asked you for the last few pods, is, do you think this is something that happens soon? Do you think it goes into free agency where he waits a week and maybe hopes something else comes along? Do you think there's any chance he opts in? I mean, where is your latest with this? I'm sure it's where it's always been, but
I think an opt-in would be shocking, honestly,
Mhm.
because I think if you're looking at it from James Harden's perspective and the max isn't there, it seems very clear that that's the case right now. You're certainly not going. That's not going to change between now and next season. You're not going to have a realistically anyway, and we'll see if he views it this way. You're not going to have a year next year that makes teams line up and say, yeah, we're definitely going to give you a long-term max when you're another year older and
yeah,
have another year of wear and tear on you and potentially another year of playoff
playoff,
failures under
yes.
your belt for people to make fun of you for. So I think he wants as long-term money as he can get this offseason, if I had to guess. Now, you could shift that into, and I brought this up on here. Maybe he says instead of 4 years at a huge salary number, or I have to take the compromise at 2+1 with an option, he just says 2 years and pay me a ton of money. And that I think is probably a good compromise option for him and the Sixers because he gets a ton of money in the short term. Let's just say he gets $100 million over 2 years or something crazy.
50 million a year would be
But
potential.
look it basically doesn't matter at a certain point. It's just you're only keeping them for 2 years. You have 2 years to win, and then you're saying arrivederci. We'll see you
Mhm.
later, and he walks out the door. I don't think that's a bad option for either side. Now, obviously, if you're the Sixers, you would want to have James on a 2+1, and he's making 30 something million, and you have team control, and you can trade him if you need to, and you have the best of both worlds. But I do think they're going to have to concede something here. Like you're not just going to look at James Harden and be like, yeah, we're going to do whatever we want. We'll give you whatever contract we want. He'll just be happy with it. I think the Houston threat is real enough that they have to make a concession or two to him, whether that's an extra year on a player option or just a bit of short-term money to give him on 2 years.
So, but I wonder though, do they have to make some type of compromise? Like, where is the competing team here? And there's probably not a team we don't know about or something like that. But it seems like Houston doesn't have the interest we thought. Is he really going to go back to Houston on like not a ton of money? Because that's super hard to spin. So I agree that there'll have to be something maybe, but it really feels like the Sixers are negotiating from the position of power here.
There's also the relationship side of it where if you're trying to just hammer him on every detail
True. True.
and you're dealing with a mercurial star as it is,
Yeah.
he might just wake up one day and be like, "Screw you guys. Like you're not helping me out at all or you didn't scratch my back and I sacrificed for the team a year prior and blah 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 blah." He could very well look at it that way. And so you do have to keep that in mind to some extent. I'm not saying that that should be, oh, hey, we're just going to give you another $10 million to hopefully stop you from being a jackass during
Right.
training camp or during around the trade deadline or whatever it is. And you don't re-sign him, period, if you don't think he's going to be fully bought in. But I don't think you can go into a negotiation with a legit star player and think to yourself, yeah, I'm just going to hammer this guy. I'm going to get him from every angle. You have to be willing to be a human and try to see it from their perspective.
I also wonder if maybe one of the concessions they can give, and not give because you want them to run and coach the team the way they feel is best. But with Nick Nurse here now, I wonder if maybe the real selling point they can give to James is Nurse is going to allow you to do a little bit more of what you want to do or what you feel fits your game best. So that could be one thing where in these negotiations, yes, the money is certainly part of it. The years are part of it. But maybe one thing the Sixers can offer James that they didn't before that he was not expecting to get is a little more freedom in terms of on the court stuff.
I don't think Nick Nurse is that guy, frankly. I think he's very much a structure guy, and he's somebody who plays within plays or reads within a play and multiple actions within a play. And it's a lot of now some of that / a lot of that is going to be on the other guys with off-ball movement and screening, and he's going to run the offense. But this is not Mike D'Antoni, right? Where he's going to give James the ball and say, your show, buddy. That is not what's happening here. And so I don't think that's a giant carrot. Now, it could just be that he thinks Nick Nurse is a smart guy and believes in his ideas, and that's just a good enough motivator to come back and be on friendly terms with the team. But I don't think that Nick Nurse giving him freedom is a big sales pitch of the offseason.
So the final question I have for you in regards to the draft is, and I know James isn't really draft related, but the Sixers go into this draft without a draft pick. As you mentioned, it's, I believe, the first time in franchise history, or at least the first time in a really long time since that has happened. You look at future years, they have the 20 and 29 first round pick. If you look at it, in theory, they should have 12 picks until then, 1 in the first, 1 in the second. They only have 8 of those 8 picks. 6 of them come from the second round of 2027 and later. They don't have a first round pick this year. They don't have a first round pick in 2025. They don't have one in 2027. They can't really trade the ones in 2024 and 2026. Like, they are pretty tapped out when it comes to draft capital. They lost picks because of the tampering charges with Daniel House and PJ Tucker. They traded that pick away in the Matisse Thybulle deal that they would have had this year that would have been relatively high. My question for you is, do you think Daryl has been too reckless with these draft picks? We've gone from two kind of extremes, Sam Hinkie hoarding all the draft picks, to now the Sixers basically just give them away. Like, it's underrated. They gave away 2 first-round picks in that James Harden deal. And I know the Sixers have been competitive, and maybe if they win a title last year, which they were, in my opinion, relatively close to doing, everything is different, right? But what do you think about how Daryl has handled the use of the draft picks?
I don't really take issue with the Harden one because I do think that made an actual difference in their on-court fortunes. Now, hard to say that when they didn't go literally any further than they did with
but they were
Ben
better.
Simmons during his tenure. But yes, they were better and had a better chance to beat a very good team in the playoffs. I would say where you start to quibble are the smaller moves, or maybe not. Yeah, I guess it is a smaller move, but the Al Horford trade, for example, tying up a first-round pick, trading him away for Danny Green, that looks a little worse in hindsight. Mm-hmm. I think if you look at a move like trading 4 second-round picks for George Hill, I know people don't really care about second-round picks, but frankly, they've done a good job of drafting guys under Morey in the second round. Guys like Isaiah Joe, guys like Paul Reed. Well, Isaiah Joe's a sore subject because they did cut him, obviously.
Yeah. Now, and he didn't make that trade, right? Was that Brett or was that Colangelo?
What do you mean?
The George Hill trade.
No, George Hill was during Daryl's first season here.
Oh, wow. God, that feels like forever ago.
Because that was Doc's first season here. That was the deadline during that season. So when you make those type of trades, so here we go. We have a Louis appearance.
I was going to say, I just thought it threw me off.
Yeah. He decided to jump up. So those I think are more hurtful than people realize. Number one, because they just have less stuff to move around, and they have less stuff. For example, I've mentioned on the pod and in articles, they're trying to buy a second round pick. Like that's a very real
Mhm.
priority for them. They've had a lot of second round picks that they just gave away for various
Yeah.
players who didn't pan out, or they used second round picks, identified some pretty good talent, and then didn't keep that talent around. So that's the stuff where I say, look, especially now, second round picks are even more valuable. And teams are using those as they traded for real players at the deadline last year with, 4 or 5 second round picks. That was Sadiq Bey got traded for a bunch of
Mhm.
second round picks last season. So that's an example of where I think they've been a little too loose with it. I'm never going to get that angry about. I mean, if you look at the other type of star trades that are out there, and especially if you consider just how bad Ben Simmons looked last year, trading 2 first round picks for James Harden looks like an absolute steal when you
Yeah,
consider
that's
that
fair.
otherwise they would have been locked into one of the worst contracts in the league with Ben Simmons.
Until they get Zion, then they'll have the other worst contract in the
All
league. But
right, all right.
no, I think with Daryl, like it's in all sports, it's kind of like this. I'll never blame a GM for trying to go all in and trying to win when you think you have a chance, which I think the spirit of these trades have been a lot of. He had to get out of the Horford deal. That's a different one. And you're right, in retrospect, doesn't look as good. But to get out of Ben, to get James, to give up those first round picks, I understand it. It's like when the Phillies handed out all that money to guys in '08 and traded away all those prospects to try to win. And they ended up not winning again after '08. But I don't blame them for trying. So I don't think Daryl can be blamed for it. But the issue is when you don't win and you've completely kind of been a little, carefree with these picks, that's why on Thursday night you don't have any. And that's why it's going to be tough for them to make trades. And that's how Tobias turns into your most valuable asset that you have, really, outside of Maxine and B until 2029. So I don't blame him for the strategy, but he is definitely, now that all the moves are done, like, yeah, it doesn't look great, the amount of resources that they have. So on Thursday night, though, as you mentioned, they're going to try to buy a second round draft pick. Everybody will wait all night with bated breath for that. Maybe we get a Toby trade early on, but before we get out of here, you want to make any big, bold predictions or any predictions for Thursday night?
I think there'll be a big trade, but I'm not going to tie
For the
anyone's
Sixers, you're
name
saying.
to it. Yeah, I
Okay.
I just I just feel like Tobias is going to get traded. And this is not reporting. This is
Right.
me just looking at the landscape, hearing what I've heard from around the league where there's just this expectation he gets moved. Now that being said, as I've said throughout this podcast, there's not been a team connected to him. There's not been I'm here and they're trying to get XYZ for Tobias. This is just kind of a looking at the landscape, knowing they kind of need to shake things up a little bit. That would be my wild guess, but it is just a guess right now until maybe I put in some phone calls and we see what that turns up.
Well, as I say off the pod, as I said in the beginning when we started the pod, and I said in the middle of the pod, make sure you are following Kyle on Twitter, reading his words on Philly Voice. And even though I'm going on vacation, maybe we'll try to have an emergency pod if something does happen. So thank you to everybody for listening. Make sure you download that Odyssey app. Make sure you're leaving those 5-star reviews. Somebody left a review, 5 stars, ripped me to shreds, but it was a 5-star review. So it still made me happy at the end of the day. So you are welcome to take shots at me as long as they're 5-star reviews. So until next time, either whether it be Friday morning or even sooner if there's a trade, talk to you next time, man.
Talk to you guys soon.